So, you want to hear about the Battle of Yen's Pass? Fine, but I'm warning you right now, this is not the story you think it is. You're expecting blood, artillery fire, maybe a few dramatic speeches, and yes, we'll get there, but the part nobody talks about, the part that actually matters, starts with a human crouching in the mud, staring at a dead Vorrkai soldier, like it personally insulted his mother. Let me back up. The Sovereign Reach had been at war with the Vorrkai Dominion for 11 years by the time Princess Sevalyn Orath-Dun was given command of the 7th Harrow Battalion. 11 years. That's not a war anymore, that's a lifestyle choice. The Vorrkai, in case you've somehow avoided every history scroll ever printed, were not pleasant beings. 7 feet tall on average, 4 arms, skin like layered volcanic rock, and a cultural philosophy that essentially translated to, what is yours is also ours, and what is ours is none of your business. They had been pushing east through the Yen Mountain corridor for 3 months, and the Sovereign Reach's response had been, let's call it creatively ineffective, which is why Sevalyn was standing in a command tent at 2 in the morning, staring at a tactical map that looked like someone had sneezed on it, wondering if she had made a catastrophic error in accepting this commission. She was 26. Brilliant, yes. Trained by the best military architects the Reach had produced in a generation, absolutely. But brilliant and 26 is still 26, and the Vorrkai did not care about your credentials. They'll come through the northern ridge, said Lieutenant Paris Okolik, her second in command, tapping the map with 2 fingers. Paris was a tall, angular man from the coastal provinces, perpetually calm in a way that either meant he was extraordinarily disciplined or completely disconnected from the severity of their situation. Sevalyn had never quite determined which. They came through the northern ridge last time, she said. They know we know that. They came through the northern ridge and won last time, Paris replied, with the particular tone of someone who considers facts to be socially neutral. Sevalyn pressed her palms flat on the table and studied the contour lines. The pass was a nightmare of geography. Narrow choke points, steep elevation shifts, loose shale on the eastern faces that made any kind of flanking maneuver feel like a suggestion rather than a strategy. And somewhere out in the dark, 40,000 Vorrkai soldiers were sitting in their camps, eating their food, sharpening their weapons, and absolutely not losing sleep over Princess Sevalyn Orath-Dun. This was when Corporal Yusuf Baraka walked into the tent. Now, I need you to understand something about Yusuf Baraka. He was human. This matters. The Sovereign Reach was, and still is, what scholars politely call a multi-species coalition, which is a diplomatic way of saying they'd recruited anyone willing to bleed for them. Humans had been part of the Reach for about 60 years at this point, not long by galactic standards, long enough apparently to start showing up in corporal ranks and walking into command tents unannounced. Yusuf was 29, medium height, built like someone who had spent years doing things that were extremely physical and extremely quiet. He had brown skin, close-cropped hair, and eyes that moved constantly, not nervously, but with the calm, methodical sweep of something that was always cataloging. He was also covered in mud from the knees down and carrying something wrapped in a cloth under his arm, which he set on the edge of the map table without asking permission. Sevalyn looked at the cloth bundle. Then at him. Corporal, Princess, he said it the way someone confirms the sky is blue. Just a fact, acknowledged and set aside. You've been outside the perimeter. Yes. Paris made a sound that might have been a cough or a suppressed objection. The standing order, Sevalyn said slowly, is that no one crosses the perimeter after sundown without direct authorization from my office. I know, Yusuf said, and unfolded the cloth. Inside was a Vorrkai rank badge, a section of cut rope, specifically, the kind used in their mobile artillery harnesses, 3 pressed soil samples in small sealed containers, and what appeared to be a fragment of a Vorrkai ration wrapper with writing on it. Sevalyn stared at the collection of objects. What, she said, is this? Evidence, Yusuf said. He pulled the ration wrapper free and set it in front of her. That's a supply order. Partial, but enough. They're not storing artillery at the Northern Ridge Depot anymore. They moved it 48 hours ago. He pointed to one of the soil samples. The compaction pattern in this one is consistent with heavy-wheeled platform movement. The Vorrkai use a specific tread spacing on their siege units, wider than standard. There's a fresh track corridor about 2 kilometers northeast of the eastern shale face. Silence in the tent. You went 2 kilometers past the perimeter, Paris said. The information was 2 kilometers past the perimeter, Yusuf replied, as if this distinction were important. Sevalyn picked up the soil sample and turned it over in her fingers. How long have you been doing this? 4 nights. She looked up at him. 4 nights. I wanted to be sure before I brought you anything. Here's the thing about that moment, and I say this as someone who has reviewed the battle records extensively, interviewed 12 surviving members of the 7th Harrow, and spent a deeply uncomfortable afternoon with Paris Okole, who is somehow still alive and still annoyingly calm. Here's the thing. Princess Sevalyn had been briefed on human intelligence operatives. She knew, theoretically, that humans had a peculiar aptitude for what their own military scholars called pattern recognition under stress. Something about their evolutionary history. Apparently their ancestors spent a very long time chasing things and being chased by things, which had produced a brain unusually good at reading environmental signals, tracks, displacement, the way broken grass bends and for how long, the particular kind of silence that means something large has been nearby recently. She knew this. In the way you know a historical fact without truly feeling the weight of it. She felt the weight of it now. They're not hitting the northern ridge, she said. No, Yusuf confirmed. They're going to let us defend the northern ridge, enthusiastically, while the real assault comes through the eastern shale, which every tactical model in your arsenal says is impassable for heavy units. It is impassable for heavy units. It's impassable for Vorrkai heavy units moving at standard pace. He paused. If they spend 2 weeks cutting a corridor and compacting it with pre-run platforms, section by section, traveling only at night, and they use the ambient noise from your own forward patrols to mask the equipment sound, he spread his hands. It's still miserable, but it's passable. Paris was no longer calm. This was notable. 2 weeks, he said. They've been running night operations for 2 weeks, and our forward scouts didn't. Your forward scouts are looking for things that are there, Yusuf said, without any particular judgment in his voice. They're good at cataloging what they can see. They weren't looking for what was absent. He touched the rope fragment. Vorrkai artillery units always have a secondary harness tie-off on the left side of the platform. Always, it's a safety protocol. They've used it for a century. I've looked at every piece of artillery the Reach has recovered or captured in 11 years of this war. Every single one has it. I went to the Northern Ridge Depot site, the one they abandoned, and there's no secondary harness marks in the ground, which means the artillery that was staged there was never real artillery. It was decoys. Wooden frames with weight bags, moved during the day when your observers would see them. The tent was very quiet. Outside, distantly, the wind moved through the Yen Mountains, with the low, toneless sound of something enormous breathing. Sevalyn set the soil sample down. She looked at the map. She looked at the eastern shale face, the approach that every tactical assessment, every experienced officer, every model of Vorrkai military doctrine said was irrelevant. How many are coming through the east? She asked. I think the artillery is a feint within a feint, Yusuf said. Move the heavy guns east, make you react to that. But the real weight is infantry. Fast units. The eastern approach is narrow enough that you can only engage in column, which neutralizes your numerical advantage and your defensive formations. If they hit the shale face with 4,000 or 5,000 fast infantry while you're looking north expecting siege equipment, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Why are you a corporal? Paris asked, somewhat involuntarily. Yusuf looked at him. I'm good at being quiet and not being noticed. That tends to work better in lower ranks. Sevalyn had been staring at the map for 30 seconds without speaking. This was, according to Paris's later account, deeply unusual for her. Sevalyn processed fast. The fact that she'd gone still meant the information was requiring genuine recalibration, not just refinement. I need to verify this, she said finally. I know, Yusuf said. I can take a 2-person team to the corridor location and bring back physical confirmation within. You're not going back out there. Princess, you're not going back out there tonight, she said. And there was something in her voice, not quite anger, and not quite what I'd call respect either. Not yet, but something in that vicinity. Something like the first moment you realize a situation is more serious than you thought, and the feeling that goes with that is not entirely unpleasant. You're going to sit down, drink something, and walk me through every observation in sequence. Then we're going to build a response plan. And then if the plan requires verification, I'll authorize a reconnaissance mission with a proper team." Yusuf looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Also," she said, pulling a chair back from the table with her foot and dropping into it without ceremony, "the next time you spend 4 nights conducting unsanctioned intelligence operations behind enemy lines, I would like a briefing at the end of the first night, not the 4th. The dataset wasn't complete at the end of the first night. I don't care. Brief me anyway." She pointed at the chair across from her. "Sit." He sat, and somewhere out in the dark, 40,000 Vorrkai soldiers had absolutely no idea that a human corporal covered in mud had just unraveled. No, wait, I'm not allowed to use that word. Had just taken apart their entire 2-week operation in 45 minutes, spread the pieces on a command table like a puzzle completed in reverse, and pointed at exactly where it had gone wrong. Poor things. They really should have moved the secondary harness marks. So, where were we? Right. A human corporal sitting across from a princess, an overturned Vorrkai deception operation between them on the table like a very expensive meal nobody ordered, and approximately 6 hours before everything was going to become extremely loud and permanent. Sevalyn did not sleep that night. Neither did Yusuf, which was either dedication or the particular kind of wired alertness that sets in after days of operating alone in hostile terrain. Paras slept for exactly 90 minutes on a cot in the corner, woke up looking completely refreshed, and Sevalyn briefly considered having him evaluated for some kind of neurological condition. By the time the sky outside the tent had shifted from black to the deep gray that precedes dawn in the Yen Mountains, they had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It required moving 2 full infantry companies from their northern ridge positions without the Vorrkai noticing, which meant the movement had to happen in stages, dressed as routine supply rotation, during the window between the last Vorrkai scout cycle and first light. It required positioning their mobile artillery not facing north, as every Vorrkai observer would expect, but angled southeast, hidden behind a ridge spur that Yusuf had identified on his 3rd night out as a natural masking feature. And it required, most critically, that the northern ridge defense look completely normal, fully manned, lights maintained, patrol patterns unchanged, while being quietly hollowed out from the inside. It was, in short, the kind of plan that works beautifully if every single element executes perfectly, and turns into a very well-documented catastrophe if even one piece slips. "You're confident in the timing?" Sevalyn asked. She was looking at the eastern corridor marking Yusuf had added to the map in red chalk, a thin line threading through terrain that had been blank and irrelevant for 11 years of this war. "The compaction work they've done is thorough, but the corridor is still slower than open ground," Yusuf said. "Moving fast infantry in column through that kind of terrain, at night with noise discipline, they can't rush it. I'd estimate 4 to 5 hours from the point where they commit to the approach. Which means if they launch at pre-dawn, which is their standard opening window, they arrive at the eastern face at full light," Paras said, "when they expect our attention to be entirely fixed on the northern engagement." "Yes." Sevalyn tapped the map twice with one finger. "We give them the northern engagement. A credible one," Yusuf agreed. "Enough fire, enough movement, enough radio traffic to confirm to their observers that we've taken the bait completely. And then," Sevalyn said, leaning back, "we close the corridor." What she meant by close the corridor, and this is where the plan went from uncomfortable to genuinely unpleasant, was that once the Vorrkai fast infantry committed fully to the eastern approach, you had them in a situation every military commander throughout recorded history had nightmares about. They were in column, in a narrow corridor, with no room to deploy, no room to receive reinforcement, no ability to communicate their situation clearly to the command structure behind them. The front of the column would hit the reaches repositioned infantry. The rear of the column would be where Sevalyn intended to be, personally, with 300 cavalry blocking the exit. Paras had objected to the personal part. Sevalyn had listened attentively and then told him to prepare the cavalry orders. This was apparently standard operating procedure for her. Based on Paras's complete lack of surprise, the order went out at 3:40 in the morning. Quiet, fast, through runners rather than radio, because Yusuf had pointed out almost gently that the Vorrkai almost certainly had someone listening to their frequencies. Supply rotation teams began shuffling companies. Lights stayed on in the northern positions. Patrol patterns continued unchanged. From the outside, looking through a Vorrkai observer scope, the 7th Harrow Battalion was doing exactly what a well-trained, thoroughly deceived defending force does the night before it expects a conventional assault. Preparing, settling in, looking north, the Vorrkai began their move at 4:15. Yusuf knew this because he was, despite every instruction to the contrary, positioned on a ridgeline above the eastern corridor, with a signal mirror and a very practiced ability to make himself invisible against rock face. He had not technically disobeyed orders. Sevalyn had told him he was not going back out there that night. He had waited until the following night. This was, he would later explain with a perfectly straight face, a different night. Technically, the signal came back to Sevalyn at 4:22. One long flash, too short. Confirmed movement, eastern corridor, high numbers. She looked at Paris. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. Then she put her helmet on and went to find her horse. Now, and I want to be very clear about this, because I have explained it to 17 different people, and at least 6 of them got it wrong in their written accounts. What happened next at the Northern Ridge was not a real battle. It was theater. Very loud, very convincing, extremely expensive theater. But theater nonetheless. The reduced force on the Northern Ridge made enough noise for twice their number. The mobile artillery fired at careful intervals to suggest a full battery. The radio traffic was dense and deliberately panicked in exactly the way a command structure does when it's receiving the assault it's been expecting. The Vorrkai Northern Force pushed forward with confidence. They were encountering exactly the resistance they'd modeled. Everything was going perfectly. Inside the eastern corridor, 4,300 Vorrkai fast infantry moved at pace through the dark. No lights, full noise discipline. The corridor was tight but passable. 2 weeks of careful night work had guaranteed that, and the lead elements were 40 minutes from emerging onto the relatively open ground below the eastern shale face, where they would have room to deploy and hit the flank of a defending force that had no idea they were coming. They were 40 minutes from winning. The lead element came out of the corridor at 5:51 and ran directly into Captain Theodora Salas and 800 Reach infantry in full defensive position on ground they had been sitting on for 90 minutes, completely calm, eating breakfast. The first 3 minutes of that engagement were not, by any military account, a fair fight. But it was the rear of the column that mattered. Sevalyn hit the corridor exit from the eastern side at 5:53, with 300 cavalry and a full understanding of what a force in column cannot do when it is struck from behind on narrow ground. It cannot turn. It cannot receive the charge. It cannot do anything particularly useful except compress forward into the engagement it's already losing at the front and discover, very rapidly, that being in a column in a narrow corridor is the worst possible place to receive any information about how badly the situation has changed. The Vorrkai are, let me be absolutely clear, extraordinary soldiers. Their discipline under pressure is genuinely, without sarcasm, remarkable. The unit commanders in the column tried to break order, tried to push up the shale faces to find high ground, tried to establish defensive positions in a space with no room for defensive positions. They fought hard. They fought with the particular ferocity of a force that has been operating on precise intelligence for weeks and cannot quite accept that the intelligence was wrong. It took them 11 minutes to understand that it wasn't the intelligence that was wrong. The intelligence had been perfect. Someone had simply read the traces they left behind and understood it better than they understood themselves. The engagement lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. The Vorrkai Northern Force, receiving no signal from the eastern assault that had not arrived, and now facing what sounded like a fully engaged Reach defense, held position long enough for Sevalyn to disengage, regroup, and redirect her cavalry north in time to support the final push. By 9:40 in the morning, the Vorrkai Dominion's position in Yen's Pass had gone from overwhelming strategic advantage with a brilliant deception operation in progress to significant territorial loss with 2 engaged forces in partial encirclement. By 11:15, they were retreating. Sevalyn received the retreat signal from her forward observer, a young corporal named Breath Awan, 17 years old, absolutely terrified, absolutely impeccable in her timing, and stood in her stirrups for a moment looking at the pass. The mountains were gold and gray in the morning light. The Yen wind had shifted. It was coming from the south now, warm and dry, carrying the smell of smoke and the particular stillness that drops over a battlefield when the worst of it has passed. She found Yusuf 40 minutes later. He was where she'd expected him to be, the ridgeline observation point, which he had apparently never left, because the signal mirror was still in his hand, and he had the expression of someone who had been watching a very intricate thing happen, exactly as calculated, which for a certain kind of person is a deeply satisfying experience. He saw her coming, and to his credit, he didn't look apologetic. He looked like a man who had made a decision, and was entirely prepared to be evaluated on the quality of the outcome. Technically a different night, he said before she could speak. I know what you're going to say, she said. I'm going to say that I violated a direct order, and that the appropriate response is, I'm going to say, Sevalyn interrupted, that you spent 4 nights behind enemy lines alone, identified a 2-week Vorrkai deception operation by noticing the absence of secondary harness marks on decoy artillery, and then spent a 5th night on a ridgeline, providing real-time confirmation of an enemy movement that the outcome of this engagement entirely depended on. She paused. I'm also going to say that you are the most infuriating soldier I have commanded in 3 years of active operations. Yusuf considered this. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. No, she said, they are not. Below them, the Vorrkai were moving back through the pass in the organized, disciplined retreat of a force that was not broken, only stopped. They would regroup, they would reassess, they would eventually try something else, because that is what the Vorrkai Dominion did, had always done, and would continue to do for the foreseeable future. But not here. Not today. Not through a corridor that no longer existed as a secret. Can I ask you something? Sevalyn said. Yes. When did you know about the deception? When did you first suspect? Yusuf was quiet for a moment. Below, the last of the Vorrkai column was disappearing back into the northern approaches. A hawk, or something that functioned like a hawk in the Yen ecosystem, reddish-brown, sharp-winged, turned slow circles over the empty corridor. The 3rd day after they repositioned to the northern staging area, he said. I went out to count the artillery platforms, just counting. Routine calibration. And the number was right, the configuration was right, the guards were right. He paused, but there was dew on the wheel housings. Sevalyn looked at him. Artillery platforms get moved daily for maintenance, he said. Climate regulation, mechanical checks, harness inspections. You can't leave them fully static for 72 hours without condensation forming in the wheel joints. The Vorrkai climate control systems on mobile platforms run warm, and cold mountain air causes surface moisture. The wheel housings had a full dew line. That equipment hadn't moved in 3 days. He picked up the signal mirror and turned it in his fingers. So either their maintenance protocols had catastrophically collapsed at every unit simultaneously, or the equipment wasn't real. Dew, Sevalyn said. Dew, Yusuf confirmed. She was quiet for a long time. The hawk, or the hawk-like thing, folded its wings and dropped toward something in the valley below that was very small and very unaware of what was coming. What do you want? Sevalyn asked finally. From this commission, from the Reach. He seemed genuinely surprised by the question, which was interesting. A man who had noticed everything else had apparently not been watching for that particular approach. I want to be useful, he said, after a moment. Not performatively, just factually. You want to be useful, she repeated. It's enough, he said. Usually. Sevalyn looked at the pass one more time. The empty corridor, the gold mountains, the retreating dust of a Vorrkai force that had spent 2 weeks building something perfect and had it taken apart by a man who noticed that the wheels were dry. Then she turned her horse. I'm recommending you for field promotion, she said. And I'm requesting your permanent assignment to my battalion. I appreciate that. I'm also going to establish a standing order in writing on record that you are permitted to cross the perimeter during active intelligence operations without prior authorization, provided you report within 24 hours of each excursion. She glanced back at him. This is not because I approve of the behavior. I understand. It's because arguing with you about it clearly has no effect. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Also, she said, nudging her horse forward, the next time a deception operation has been running for 2 weeks and you've identified it on day 3, you brief me on day 3. The data set. Day 3, Corporal. A pause. The wind moved through the Yen Mountains, warm from the south, carrying nothing now but the smell of open air and the quiet particular to places where terrible things have just finished happening and haven't started again yet. Yes, Princess, Yusuf said. And that, in case you were wondering, is how the Battle of Yen's Pass ended. Not with the grand northern assault the Vorrkai had planned, not with the devastating flank strike they'd spent a fortnight constructing, not with any of the careful, brilliant, expensive machinery of a deception operation 2 years in the making. It ended with dew on a wheel housing, and a human who noticed. Sometimes, I think the rest of the galaxy still hasn't fully processed what it means to share a universe with a species whose ancestors spent 1,000,000 years chasing things through the dark, and learning to read everything the dark left behind. The Vorrkai are brilliant. Their deception was brilliant. Their execution was, frankly, impressive by any standard you care to apply. They just didn't account for the one species in the sovereign reach that doesn't look at a battlefield and see what's there. They look at what's missing. Every single time. Honestly, terrifying. 10 out of 10. Do not recommend underestimating.